This is a story I don't usually share with many people, but since I'm here, I'll share this with you all. It's about something I witnessed back when I was working for the Forest Service in Idaho, years and years ago. It was just another day on the job. I was patrolling around when I heard this bizarre noise coming from a clearing just beyond a patch of trees. It sounded like nothing I've ever heard before. It reminded me of a combination of a scream and a howl, but somehow metallic. I had my trusty rifle with me, so I felt ready for anything, or so I thought. As I walked towards the sound, the noise grew louder, more intense, almost as if it was coming from right in front of me. I stumbled upon the clearing, and that's when I laid eyes upon what I can only describe at first were three bizarre creatures, unlike anything I've ever seen. The first two were about 4 feet tall, gray in color, large black eyes, and long, thin fingers. They had a peculiar smell, even from the distance it was at. It was almost like a mix of sulfur and rotting flesh. The third was different, almost like every praying mantis, but much larger, standing about 7 feet tall, with wings that could have easily carried it away. They didn't appear hostile at first, but they certainly didn't seem welcoming. They were there, standing in the middle of this clearing, almost as if they were waiting for something. I saw in a distance this almost speck of light, so bright at first it was blinding. These beings didn't even seem bothered by it. They didn't even respond. But I was. My heart was racing. My entire being felt bad. Something was about to happen. My mind was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. This light grew closer, though, and I realized that it just wasn't a light, but it was actually some sort of weird metallic object, like a cube. It appeared right in front of these beings, and instantly they vanished, and a warm orange glow appeared around this cube. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I've heard stories about UFOs, but I never believed in that, at least until this moment. As this cube took off, the entire ground shook violently. Even the trees swayed, as if a helicopter had just landed. It was like nothing I've ever seen. After that day, I couldn't deal with the job anymore. My performance declined, steadily, but it still was a drop-off. I quit my job. The thought of going back caused me anxiety. Well, a lot more than that, looking back. Well, folks, let me tell you, when I got that call from my ex-colleague, I was taken aback. It had been 3 long years since I had quit my job. I had tried to put that strange encounter I had behind me, and how it's affected nearly every aspect of my personal life since then. My colleague, who I grew very close with during my time as a ranger, he began telling me a story he had last summer. He said he saw these strange gray alien-looking things up on a ridge. It reminded him of the story I had shared with him a few years back. Now, I hadn't shared my story with him until that point, and I was shocked that he had seen and experienced something so similar. It was like a blast from the past, but this time it wasn't just my imagination. We talked for hours, going over every detail of our encounters, trying to piece together what it all meant. We were both perplexed and scared, unsure of what to do with this newfound knowledge. But one thing was for sure. We knew that what we had seen was real, and it was something that could not be ignored. We had to find out more, to uncover the truth, no matter how frightening it may be. After that call, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was coming, something big. I started to research and read everything I could find on these encounters, just trying to make sense of it all. It was about 2 years ago. I was on a fishing trip with my buddy up in northern Minnesota. We were out in the middle of nowhere, just us two and some gear. It was later in the evening. We were getting ready to pack up and head back to the cabin. We heard this rumbling noise that we couldn't quite identify at first. We ignored it. My buddy pointed out that it might be a bear, but it sounded different. I wasn't quite hearing it the way he was. Then he grabbed me on the shoulder, looked me in the eye, and said, "Listen." And in that moment, we both heard the noise. This very discernible growling sound, but it was far deeper and louder than I remembered, even though the sound had just happened not even 5 seconds before. My buddy didn't seem shaken. He seemed petrified. We began moving back to the cabin very quickly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that sound was, whatever animal it came from, was following us. Every time I turned around, I could have sworn there was something moving just beyond the line of sight, in the shadows behind the trees. But every time I'd look, nothing was ever there. Fortunately, we finally made it back to the cabin. I assumed I could finally relax, and we did for about 45 minutes. But sure enough, the noise started. This time it was louder, coming from the back side of the cabin, where the woods are the thickest. We did our best to ignore it, but it just kept growing in volume, getting louder and louder. I finally decided to have a look, so I grabbed my flashlight, telling myself the entire time, there's no way. And I saw it for the first time. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. It reminded me of a bear. Kind of. It was just much more muscular, much more slender, but about the same size physically. Its head, though, was much more like a wolf than that of a bear. Its jaws protruded. It had large fangs. Kind of reminded me of a saber-toothed cat, considering the canines were so exaggerated. And the eyes were red. I'm not talking like lens red, like a glowing, eerie, evil red. What we were dealing with, I wasn't sure. For a while, I had always just assumed that this was a dire wolf, but the more and more I've researched, the more and more I begin to challenge that notion. Anyway, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to back away slowly, but it seemed to be moving in my direction. I could feel that it was hunting me. I quickly ran back in the cabin, not telling my friend what had happened. I locked the door. And sure enough, shortly later, I could hear it scratching. My buddy was freaking out. He knew. We both knew. We just didn't know what to do. Eventually, it stopped. We waited and waited. The night was eerily quiet. We didn't see anything after that, but we could still sense it was out there. We packed up and left that night. I never went back there, and I haven't been on a fishing trip since. I have an experience that I'd like to share with you. In 2004, I was living in a town called Newcastle, Pennsylvania. It's roughly an hour from Pittsburgh, give or take, depending on traffic. I had just moved there with my then husband, and we were renting the top floor of this house that was owned by an older couple who had lived on the first floor. They were very pleasant, nice people, but they did not have any children or grandchildren. So they weren't really interested in having people around. I mean, it suited us just fine because my husband and I both worked long hours at our jobs. We did have one neighbor, though. His name was Bill, and he lived across the street and was in a very similar situation, rented out to somebody else who lived downstairs while he occupied the upstairs apartment himself. This is where it gets really creepy, and I get goosebumps just recalling this story. Okay, so one night, I'm lying in bed, and I could hear Bill's door open. Now, this is at least a small part of town, so it wasn't uncommon to see people walking around at all hours of the night, but what was strange about this particular instance was that his door opened and then closed again almost immediately after. So I thought nothing of it until maybe an hour later when he knocked on our front door. My husband answered the door and let him in because we knew him well enough to know that something must have been wrong for him to be knocking on our door at 2 a.m, or whatever time it was by then. He came into our living room where my husband had sat down with him and just started crying uncontrollably. I'm not talking about just sobbing, like sobbing really hard, like somebody had died or something equally as serious. We were both very confused, and as you can imagine, it was pretty awkward. Why was he acting this way? He eventually calmed down and told us. Here's where things get even more bizarre. He informed us that while sitting in his apartment earlier that evening, there was a knock at his front door. Made no sense because we were the only ones who lived upstairs from him, so there could have been nobody else up there than himself. And there's an actual metal gate that is right at the entrance of the stairs that leads up to his door. So if you're on the outside, you have to have a key or a way to get in. You can't just make your way up to his front door without getting in. So that was already ringing bells. Anyway, he said that when he opened the door, there was a little girl standing on his doorstep, and she asked him if her mommy lived here. He told us that it took him by surprise because this child looked no older than 5 or 6, but at the same time, she had an air of maturity about her, and there was something else really wrong. Her hair was covering her face, and he couldn't really see her face that well. Like, you could tell that when you were looking at her, she wasn't just your average kid. She also seemed to be very well dressed for being out here at night, and it seemed completely out of place and strange. So, instead of answering yes or no to whether or not Mommy lived up here, he simply closed his front door and went back into his apartment without saying anything else to the young girl, who stood outside waiting for someone or anyone to answer her question. He said then that he heard the girl walk away, go downstairs, but when he looked out his window, she was nowhere in sight, like she had just vanished into thin air or something. Now, you might be hearing this and thinking, okay, how was this at all creepy? Well, Bill went on to tell us, when we asked and prodded, that right before he responded to her, or didn't respond, she moved the hair out of her face, and he saw her eyes for the first time. I think you know where this is going. Her eyes were pitch black, and as soon as he looked into her eyes, he claimed that he felt an overwhelming sense of dread like he's never felt before. Needless to say, we were both very freaked out by his story. So my husband went to go check on his apartment and all around for any signs of where this little girl might have gone, if not for staying around the area. But there was nothing. No evidence whatsoever. And as strange as that was the last and only time that's ever happened, at least that I was aware of. It took us a little while before we can get him back into his apartment. It was such an odd tale from our neighbor, especially because he was such a level-headed guy. So this didn't feel like a prank. It felt weird. Anyway, that's my experience. And don't get me wrong, I know Pennsylvania's full of strange, unexplainable things, but that one definitely takes the cake for me. I had an experience in Dallas, Texas last summer. I was driving home from work. It was around 2:15 in the morning. At this time, I was forced to take a detour because of construction on the highway. So, I took some back roads that were familiar to me. As I drove down this road, there is a small creek on my left, and woods on both sides of the road with houses scattered throughout. The moon was full and bright enough for me to see everything clearly as it happened. I saw something in front of my car, about 50 yards ahead, moving towards a large open field. I assumed it was a dog at first, based on its physical appearance. But as I got closer, I realized this thing was actually walking on two legs. It was tall and skinny, long arms that hung down to its knees. It had a large head that reminded me of an ape, but it looked more canine and human. I could see the muscles in its back moving as it meandered across the street. I slowed my car down. I didn't know what this thing was or what it was going to do next. As soon as I stopped my car, this thing turns around and stared at me through the windshield of my vehicle, its eyes glowing a bright orange with a huge, horrid grin on its face. I could see its teeth. They were long and pointed, like fangs. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. It stood there for what felt like 10 seconds, just glaring at me, before it turned around and disappeared into the field. As soon as it vanished, I floored my car and flew towards the highway. I didn't care about detours or time anymore. After this, I never really told anybody about my experience. Because, come on, it sounds crazy. I know what I saw. This was not a dog or a person in a costume or somebody cosplaying. I'm really not sure. I don't really believe in the whole werewolf thing, but that's where my mind goes. Although that can't be because people don't really turn into werewolves. So, what was this? Before I sent this in, I did look up one thing, and that is skinwalkers, which I guess could make sense. Now, from what I've read, skinwalkers are basically people who can shapeshift into animals, but to what extent or what that looks like, I'm very ignorant on that. All I know is that I got the creeps looking at this thing, so whether it was just some unidentified animal or maybe I was just tired and seeing things, I don't know. All I know is I don't want to see it again. And God, I can't even imagine if my car had broke down right when it was standing there staring at me. My story is about my mother-in-law's house in the country outside of Huntsville, Texas. She has lived there since the early 70s, and she had bought it from her parents who built it back in the 1930s. It is an old farmhouse with a pretty big barn behind it. The property goes back into the woods quite a ways, and we always used to joke that there was a family of bears living in the woods because we would see their tracks all over the place. Anyway, my mother-in-law has had some weird experiences at her house. She lives alone now, and she will sometimes hear somebody walking around outside her bedroom window late at night when she is sleeping. She said that it sounds like somebody is wearing big, heavy work boots and stomping around, like a neighbor or something. She also says that she hears people talking outside her door, but when she goes out there, there's nobody there. She has even heard people knocking on her house in the middle of the night, but when she checks, nothing. The weirdest thing that happened, though, was a few years ago. One night, she had just gone to bed, and she said that all of a sudden, she felt like somebody was choking her. She opened her eyes to see this dark figure standing over her, looming down on her, holding her in place. She screamed, and it just vanished. A few days later, she was in her barn and she said it felt like she was being watched. So she turned around to look behind her, and there, in the deep recesses of the barn, that dark figure was moving towards her. She said it was so terrifying she booked it. Now, her description was that it was like a man in a physical build, but the face was completely black. Nothing. Needless to say, she moved out shortly after that. I have a story for you. It's about my brother, and when we were kids in the mid-70s. We lived on a farm near Red Lion, Pennsylvania. It was a big place, lots of woods and fields. Our closest neighbor lived about a half-mile away down the road. Beyond that was just open farmland for miles. We also had 2 dogs, an Irish setter named Sam and a German shepherd named Shep. Both were good dogs, as they always made sure we knew when someone came to the door or if someone had trespassed onto our property. The dogs would always bark when someone came to the door, but on this day, they seemed far more frightened than guarded. My brother and I were home alone that day as our parents had gone out for the afternoon. It was a Saturday in April of somewhere in the mid-70s. We both remember it being sunny outside, no clouds in sight, and around noon or early afternoon. We were inside playing Pong, which my dad had bought us for Christmas earlier that year, so maybe it was closer to 79. I forget. It was then that we had heard the dogs start barking. They were both outside to go potty. We both looked at each other because it had been quiet for so long and wondered who or what could have caused them to bark. As we had lived there, they usually only ever bark if somebody was coming up to the house. As far as I knew, we weren't expecting any company. But as we listened, it became apparent that Shep was barking, and Sam sounded nervous and whining. We decided to go see what was going on. When we got to the door, Sam stopped barking, but Shep kept going. We looked out the window by the door and saw our 2 dogs sitting near a large tree only about 20 yards from the house. The dog we knew as Shep was barking at something behind the tree. My brother and I couldn't see what it was, but whatever it was had made a very loud sound that we later would describe as a high-pitched sound. We both looked at one another, and I remember my brother saying, "What the hell is that?" And I remember saying, "I don't know, but it's scaring me." We looked at each other for a few seconds, then decided to go outside. We did not have a gun, but we knew we had to do something. We opened the door and walked out onto our porch. As we did, the thing behind the tree stood up and turned around to face us. It was taller than the tree it had been standing behind. My brother and I both remember this very clearly, even after all these years. The face was pale and white, deep sunken-in blue eyes, and a mouth full of what I would describe as rotting teeth. It was gaunt. It looked sickly, like a starved prisoner of war, or that's what it reminded me of. I gasped at the sight of it. It never made a differing expression, other than its mono-looking face. It stood there for what seemed like forever, but was probably only about 5 seconds. My brother and I, out of fright, turned around and ran back into the house. We slammed the door shut and looked out the window to see if it was walking away from our house, back in the direction of the woods. Oh, I forgot to mention that when it stood up from a crouching position, both our dogs had started going nuts, and they actually ran back over to us because they were frightened. We didn't see where this thing went after it left. We never did see it again. It was a few months later that my parents finally told us and our brother that there are things on this property we can't understand. They never outright said what it was, but they pretty much alluded to what it was. They kept referring to it as evil and to be very careful. To this day, I still remember the face of that thing and the sound it made. I also remember how scared my brother and I were when we saw it. I felt its evil. It felt like it was emanating hatred. I don't know why it was on our property, but my parents had told us that they had seen it before, and that's why they always had an ample amount of gunfire in the house. I don't know if they've ever shot one, but after seeing that thing, I can honestly say I would have felt safer. I can also say that after seeing this thing, I never went outside without a gun until I was in my 30s and felt safer and more confident. It's weird looking back on that house because there was just this strange aura that surrounded the entire place. In addition to what I just told you, my parents experienced a host of strange, supernatural phenomenon. Everything you would expect from a typical haunting situation. As it turns out, there is a really old graveyard no more than 3 miles away from our house. If you were to go on the back side of that property, through some woods, you would get to it. It's actually one of the oldest in the area, and I've been told that some very notable witches have been buried there. I'm not sure if what we saw that evening has anything at all to do with what I just told you, but it is interesting. The farm has been sold and my parents have passed on, but I wish they would have told us more about what happened before they died. It's funny because my brother and I still laugh about that today. We do have a certain amount of fear, though. It's like when you're a kid and you see a scary movie, but then after seeing it, you still love watching those same movies. Thankfully for my brother and I, we really don't remember a whole lot of the hauntings that would occur in the house. I know that when my brother and I moved out for college, they were plagued by it for at least 3 years, and then suddenly stopped. Despite the eerie experiences we had on our farm, my brother and I had a pretty normal childhood. We spent most of our time outside, exploring the woods and fields, playing with our dogs. We never expected to come face to face with whatever we did. After that incident, my parents were more understandably cautious. They always made sure we had a gun in the house and warned us to be careful when we were outside, even though we never saw anything else as frightening as that. There were other strange occurrences in our house. One of them I remember specifically, well, not in the house, but was a large field my brother and I would play by our house. It always felt wrong after that initial experience. The best way I could summarize it was just, it felt unwelcoming, that you should not be there. And this was just a large empty field with tall grass. There was nothing there, but it just had this feeling. Even my father did not like us playing in that field. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something I did not. This story goes back to when I was 12. I was on Red Lake Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota, not far from where the movie Fargo was filmed. It's very rural, woods all around the house, prime wolf territory as well. I used to go outside all the time and play with friends. I was about 12 years old at the time. My sister and I were in our backyard, which is a large field that leads to a thick patch of woods. It was dusk, and we were playing. All of a sudden, these two creatures came out of the woods on all fours, but stood up in front of us. They were about 7 feet tall, covered in reddish hair. I can vividly remember the smell and how awful it was, like rotten meat, or something very similar to that. The first thing that comes to my mind is roadkill that's been sitting out. They had no clothes on, but I don't remember seeing genitalia or nipples. These things were very muscular. Their faces reminded me of a cross between a wolf and human. They had long arms with hands that looked like they could grab things. Very similar to a raccoon's hands, actually. The fingers were long, but the thumbs were not big. The feet reminded me of a human's as well, but the toes were long and curved. I remember seeing these things in front of me, but my sister ran, and I followed her. We ran and ran till we got to the house, locking all the doors and windows. I kept seeing these things for the next 2 weeks. They were in the woods, and I would see them at night when I looked out my bedroom window, which faced the woods. One night, I saw one of them standing near a telephone pole, looking up at the sky as if they were searching for something. Another night, I saw them near our chain link fence. They were walking along it, looking around as if searching for something. I stopped seeing them after that, which is about 2 weeks. I thought it was strange that they disappeared so quickly. I never told anybody about this and didn't talk to my sister about it either. She had already been through enough with some of the childhood trauma that her and I endured. My mother passed away about 15 years ago now, and we never told her about this. I only told my father because at one point he had asked me if I'd ever seen anything strange when we lived in that house. So I openly told him about the creatures, and he said it was probably a wolf. But I know what a wolf looks like, and these things were not wolves. I am a proud Native American Cherokee, to be exact, and know what my people have seen on our reservations. These were not Native American wolves or any dogs I've ever seen. I've seen wolves, and these just were not like them. I'm a very serious person. I believe in God and the Bible. I did see these things with my eyes, and they were really there. I've never told anyone outside of my family and maybe a friend or two. My family has seen these creatures many times. I know there are others who have also seen them, but are afraid to talk about them. This area is full of stories, and I know you have heard many of them. But this is one for my family. My grandfather was an old traditional Native American man. He actually lived on the reservation in northern Minnesota and actually passed away when I was about 8. He was a medicine man and very spiritual. My family told me that he had seen these creatures many times while out in the woods hunting or gathering medicinal plants. He told my family that these were not normal animals, and that we should be very careful while in the woods because it's not safe. He told my father that he should never go into the woods alone and to always take a rifle with him when going hunting or gathering plants. I remember when my grandfather passed, all of his family and friends were there to honor him and say goodbye. My father took me out to the garage where we keep all of our tools and hunting equipment. He had a pistol and 2 rifles on the table. My father told me that these are for protection because there are spirits in the woods that watch over us. They can sometimes be seen, but only by those who have the certain knack for it, that have the eyes to see. Anyway, my father told me that my grandfather had come back and watched over us, that he was sitting in a chair by a table and watching us. I remember seeing my father's eyes welled up in tears as he explained to me and my other sister that he could see our grandfather. He was also told to never go into the woods alone, and also told us that. He explained to us there are things in the woods that we can't understand and that will try to trick us. Evil spirits. I have never forgotten what he's told me, and believe everything he told me about the spirit world. I also firmly believe that what I saw and what he experienced are very real. I'm sorry if this information seems jumbled. Hopefully you can make sense of it. To make it more clear, when I was 8, my grandfather passed. We were at his celebration of life, where my father basically saw my grandfather and informed us to be careful while being in the woods. Fast forward to being 12 years old, and I had my first sighting of these strange creatures. Now that only lasted for about 2 weeks. Fast forward to when I was older, and I finally got a chance to tell my dad about it. Hopefully that clears things up. A few months ago, I went camping with my family. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for a while, but our parents' busy schedule had made us cancel our plans time and time again. My siblings and I had given up until Dad told us we would be having a camping trip over the weekend. My siblings and I were thrilled, to say the least, as they had been looking forward to the camping trip for a long time. Mom and Dad had planned the campsite, and they had marked a spot that would be perfect. We all looked forward to the weekend, and we all shouted in ecstasy as the week had ended. Late Friday afternoon, we were on our way to the campsite. I was more composed compared to my siblings. They were so hyper. Mom had to threaten them before they could stop their noises. After a 30-minute drive, we got to the campsite. It was a location close to the woods. The scenery was great, and the atmosphere was perfect. While I admired the scenery, I had a slight, discomforting feeling about the woods. It was like I could feel a presence. The presence was ghostly and gave me chills. I shook my head lightly and pushed the thoughts out of my mind, blaming it on paranoia. We got our camping gear out and the car and arranged them. I helped my father set up the tents, while my siblings helped Mother bring out the things from the car. A little while later, everything was set up and our camping was underway. It was dark by the time we were done, and so we huddled together by a fire as it was a bit chilly. Mom served us some snacks that she had brought along, and everyone munched away. My siblings requested to hear some scary stories, as if on reflex, my mind went back to the presence I had felt earlier in the day, and once again, a chill ran through me, making me shiver. I wanted to stop my father and tell him it was a bad idea, but ultimately, I chose not to say anything. Dad and Mom told their share of ghost stories, spooking my siblings so much. It took a bit of effort to get them into bed. A few minutes later, I moved a bit deeper into the woods to take a leak, as I had drunk too much water. I grabbed a light, heading off into the wilderness to relieve myself. After walking what I would have considered a considerable distance, I squatted down when I felt this sensation of being watched. This time around, the chill I felt was bone deep. It felt like somebody had poured a bucket of ice-cold water on my body. I turned around to take a look, but to my surprise, I found no one. I turned to face front. Then I saw it, standing right in front of me. I was rooted to the spot. I didn't know if this was caused by fear or shock. I had no idea. I didn't know what to call it. It was not human. That much was certain. I let out a scream, and the last thing I remember was seeing bright lights before I passed out. When I awoke, I found myself in a bright room, strapped to a chair. I was surrounded by machines and devices of all sorts. It was at this point that it hit me. I had been abducted by aliens. While I was struggling to get out of my constraints, one of them came in. It looked at me curiously and touched my face. Its hands were cold, and they gave me the chills. They reminded me of the chill I had felt earlier in the forest. Was that as a result of them touching me? It then moved towards one of the computers, inputted something. It beeped and displayed a language that was unknown to me, and while I was trying to understand what they meant, an electric shock ran through me, making me convulse violently on the chair. After a while, the shocks had stopped, but my body felt numb, and I had a sensation that I had been pricked by thousands of needles. Turning back to look at me, I saw a pensive look on its face as it faced the computer again while inputting something else. I had a look of terror on my face as I felt an intense pain course through my body. The pain was so great, it threatened to tear my mind apart. A few minutes felt like an eternity while enduring this hellish pain. I was put through several other tests before it shook its head and stepped out of the room. A few minutes later, it came in with others of its kind. I was surprised to see that they all looked the same. They all looked at me, and I could faintly hear them muttering something like, "Another failure. Return her to where you picked her from." I was glad to wake up at our campsite, where I had the protection of my parents. To my surprise, our camping trip was concluded. It was Sunday afternoon. I had been gone for almost 2 days. With trepidation, I recounted my ordeal to my parents, but to my surprise, they laughed at me and told me I did not go anywhere. I was present all through the camping exercise. They both noticed that I was a bit absent-minded, and I guess I behaved mechanically, like a robot that has been programmed to do a particular set of tasks. Except for my absent-mindedness, I was present all through, so my tale of aliens and being abducted was discounted as a lie by my parents. They found it hard to believe. They did not believe in the existence of that, or extraterrestrial life. Despite all they said, I knew everything I felt was real. The story of the Michigan Dogman might have an iota of truth in it, after all. There have been more sightings than Bigfoot. The first sighting of the Michigan Dogman was in 1887 in Wexford County, Michigan. The creature is said to be a 7-foot-tall, blue-eyed or amber-eyed bipedal canine-like animal, featuring the torso of a man and a terrifying howl that is reminiscent of a human's scream. According to myths, the Michigan Dogman appears every decade that falls on years that end with 7. Numerous sightings have been recorded in various locations all throughout Michigan, especially in the northwestern quadrant of the Lower Peninsula. This beast was previously unknown to most people until the late 20th century. It was first sighted around the Manistee River, back in the days when some of the native tribes lived around there. The first alleged encounter of the Dogman happened in 1887 in Wexford County. A couple of lumberjacks saw a creature which they described as having a man's body and a dog's head. In 1937, in Paris, Michigan, Robert Fortney suffered a heart attack from 5 wild dogs, and he also claimed that one of the 5 walked on 2 legs like a human. Rumors of similar creatures also came from the Allegan County in the 1950s, also in Manistee and Cross Village in 1967. While there was talk of the creature being of supernatural origins, others believe that there are scientific animal-based theories for this creature's existence. Dogman sightings started in Michigan and then spread with a few variations to the description, but the main characteristics remain the same. This was anticipated with any growing, migrating, and evolving species. Dogman sightings usually happen deep in the forest, around logging camps, and out on deserted roads late at night. In 1987, it gained a new popularity when famous Traverse City radio disc jockey Steve Cook wrote a song titled The Legend. Cook got his lyrics from reports of Dogman encounters, and people began reporting their sightings. Below are some encounters with the Dogman. In the fall of '86, near Manistee, Michigan, Ray Greenway was driving home from the Manistee Army recruiting station. It was quite a late night. He discovered something in the darkened fields beside him. His car headlights were reflecting off something that appeared to be eyes. But the eye of the creature was too high off the ground to be a deer. Suddenly, the unknown creature began running toward him. It made an amazing leap towards him, clearing the 2-lane road with a single jump. He described the creature as having yellow eyes and a remarkable leaping ability. In the fall of 2001, a witness allegedly claimed to have spotted a werewolf-like creature stalking the hill behind their house. She described it as black in color, like a big bear with haunches and the head of a wolf or dog. Well, that was the first and last time residents of Cass County, Michigan ever saw the Dogman. The claim to hear it splashing around the 20-acre swamp land late at night is unnerving. Sometimes they hear it shrieking once in a while. The shriek is a loud and piercing sound, like an infant's, loud and hysterical. One of the most famous encounters was an OnStar incident that occurred in 2006. The incident had happened in Troy, Michigan, in the year of 2006. A man was driving when he suddenly spotted something that he described as a great big dog standing upright right in front of him. On reflex, he immediately veered to avoid hitting the creature, and he ended up running off the road, causing the vehicle to flip on its side. Luckily, he and his passenger were unhurt, and with the help of OnStar, he got assistance. OnStar has a recording of the whole thing. And of course, in 1993, another Dogman encounter was reported by a 13-year-old girl named Courtney. She lived with her family in Reed City, Michigan. Courtney had decided to sneak out for a quick puff of cigarette behind her house one winter. That's when she got the worst scare of her life. She claimed to have seen a glint of light flickering out from the planks of an old abandoned barn. It had got her attention. She traced its movements, and she slowly realized there was something there. She saw that it was a 6-foot-tall thing with a man's body, and a dog's head was staring right at her. She took to her heels, utterly terrified. Later, her neighbors affirmed that they had also spotted a creature in the abandoned barn. What they described was a buffalo-sized dog lurking around. Other encounters describe it as having the features of a wolf, while others say it reminds them of a German shepherd on its hind legs. Whatever the depiction, it shows that there have been numerous sightings. Could the legend be nothing more than just mass hysteria? Or does this creature truly exist, lurking close by in the woods? I don't know whether this story will be scary to anyone reading this or not, but to those I've told, think it's interesting enough for them to repeat the story to others. I am a 17-year-old male, currently living in Hawaii. Lucky me, but as a child, I was raised in a Christian home in a rural part of Nevada. For as long as I can remember, I've had a fascination for the unexplained and paranormal. Unlike my Christian family, I do not believe in anything that I cannot see myself. Thus, up until recently, I only thought of the supernatural as a very ancient superstition, nothing to be afraid of or be concerned about. But, like anyone else, I like a good ghost story. Some of the horrific stories that my friends would tell me would just keep me up at night. Not in fear, but in curiosity and wonder. I would always think what the meaning behind the phantom's actions would be, or even if there would be any reason behind it at all. If a shadowy figure stood across from you down the hall, what would he be trying to accomplish? Scare you? Feed off your fear? Call out to you and help it pass over? Or is it doing that for no reason at all? This is what I was interested in, not so much of the terror aspect of it. On my free time, I would usually, and still do, watch YouTube videos about the paranormal, namely By Darkness Prevails and Let's Read. My parents, being Christian, were greatly concerned about this interest and afraid that I would invite something into our home. I didn't believe that, so I continued my routine. Now, about 4 years ago, when I still lived in my Nevada home, my 10-year-old sister, who we'll call Sarah for the sake of this story, was scared and asked if she could sleep in my bed with me. This was nothing out of the usual. Sarah was still afraid of the dark, and she believed that if she slept with me, nothing would happen, or if something did happen, she'd feel less crazy because I'd be there to witness it. Like the older brother I am, I allowed her to sleep in the same bed. Sometime later, we had gotten into an argument about something I don't remember. I ended up feeling guilty and apologized about the fight. But Sarah decided to sleep in her room, just to spite me. I saw her leave, and the way my bed was positioned, I couldn't see her after she had stepped out of my room. 10 seconds after Sarah had left, she sprints back into my room looking pale as a ghost, literally leaping onto my bed, hiding herself under my sheets, and latched onto me with a grip I had never felt before. She began sobbing. This wasn't her normal cry. It sounded like there was a force behind it, as if she wanted to cry as loud and as long as she could, but couldn't out of fear of being heard by someone or something. Her breathing was rapid, irregular, and shallow. It was like she was suffocating or drowning and gasping, reaching for air. I asked her what was wrong. She never answered. I thought somebody was in the house, so I wanted to get up and check. I moved only an inch before Sarah held me even tighter and cried, "Don't go. Please don't go." I laid back down and tried to explain, but she talked over me and repeated this about 10 more times, all before I assured her that I will stay here until she calms down. Well, about 15 minutes later, Sarah was now calm enough to talk, but she was shaking. I asked her if she felt all right to explain what had happened. Through tears, she explained the horror. When she had stepped out of my room, she saw someone standing in the room directly in front of me, in front of her. The room was my older brother's, who had moved out 7 years prior. Sarah and I had always seen things inside that room through the corner of our eyes, whether it be day or night, but when we looked, nothing would ever be there. The figure looked like my father, and it stood just enough inside the doorway for her to see its figure. It even appeared to have his exact clothes on. Its body was facing her. Its head was facing 90 degrees to her left, away from her. Once she had seen it, she realized that my father was at work driving a semi-truck to Boise, Idaho, for one of his regular runs. No other males besides me lived there. When she had realized these things, the figure slowly turned its head toward my sister, and while doing so, changed from my father's appearance into what she thinks was its own appearance. In Sarah's words, its hair was frizzy and had black and red streaks. Its eyes glowed red. It had no nose, and its skin was palish blue. You could see the veins, which were tar black. He was extremely tall and slender, long bony arms reaching past his knees. His fingers had thick, long, and sharp nails, stained with a black substance. It wasn't dripping off of his nails, it was like crusted on. It stood there, extremely straight and stiff, just staring at me. It didn't say anything or make a sound, but it filled me with this almost paralyzing fear. Seeing this, she wanted to run to my parents' room down the hall, but she feared she might not make it before this thing had caught her. So, she looked quickly behind her to see if my door was still open so she could dash into my room. When she looked back, the figure was 2 feet closer to her, still retaining the same posture and unwavering stare. As soon as she saw this, she turned and bolted into my room. To her, these few steps into my room seemed and felt like a mile. She felt it get closer and closer each step she took. But right as she set foot in my room, she felt it stop or leave. But she never looked back to check. Then she launched herself onto my bed, hiding herself, latching onto me. Once she had finished, I wanted to believe that this was true and see for myself. But somehow I knew that it wouldn't be there now. I thought about telling our parents about this, but who would believe it? I knew they wouldn't. No parent ever does or wants to when this sort of thing happens. "You just had a nightmare," they'd say, or "It was just your imagination." Thinking about their response got me doubting in Sarah's story, but the utter terror and exhausted look that my sister had made me dismiss my own doubts. Eventually, we decided to tell our parents. I went first, of course, with her tightly hanging on behind me. When I left my room, I didn't see the figure, which I knew was going to happen and made me feel relieved and bummed at the same time. Upon reaching our parents' room and telling them about it, they said the exact things I predicted. My sister, once hearing their response, snapped and began yelling through sobs to them. What was I thinking? I should have never told you. You never would have believed unless you saw what I saw. I thought by telling you, you would comfort me. But instead, you're sweeping it under the rug and telling me that I'm crazy. Sarah is a sweet and respectful girl. She never raised her voice at our parents, even if she wanted to. So this caught our parents' attention and fully woke them up. They realized through this outburst and my account of the event that this was indeed true. My mom called a pastor. It was 12:51 a.m. to come and bless the house. The pastor came, prayed, burned incense, and other rituals to cleanse our home. I didn't believe any of this worked, but it made my sister feel a little more at ease, so that made me in turn feel better. My parents and Sarah never told anyone of this, still believing it could be some imagination, and I only told a few close friends when they would sleep over. Fortunately, we moved 2 years later to Hawaii, leaving that thing behind. Although other things, such as bowls falling out of the cabinets by themselves or random but ghastly screams, have happened. Nothing ever occurred before or after. That was, of course, as serious as all of this. After this event, I wanted to know what my sister saw, so I searched and scoured online for what it could have been. I thought that maybe it was a Wendigo or a rake, but all of those things would have killed her, and probably all of us if it was those things. If you think you know what this could be, please let me know. Thank you for hearing my story.